Hi. Hello, my name is Stephanie Farrell. I am a nurse and I've worked in clinical research for over 15 years. So I am so excited to be with you today to share with you why clinical trials are so important, give you a little background on what they are for those of you who might not know, and why they're so important for all of us, especially in the day and age of COVID. I'm going to go ahead and advance my slide here. Brett, could you share, I think, am I screen sharing or are you? There we go. Oh, excellent. And pardon us while we're learning Zoom and getting used to this new technology. I love being in auditoriums and being with people in person, but this is just going to have to do it for now. Typically, I'm in a mask, so you see me without a mask tonight, but everywhere I am where there's other people, except for my home, I am wearing a mask. So in the program today, we're going to be learning what is a clinical trial. Why is research and clinical trials important? How do you go about gathering information to help you make good decisions? I'm going to give you some questions to ask your healthcare providers and your physician about the benefits and risks of treatment and whether that's standard of care or clinical trials. I'm going to talk to you about how new treatments are developed, kind of dispel some of the myths of clinical trials and give you the facts, and tell you how to locate those trials that might be good for you and how Eisenhower can help with that. So this little slide kind of says it all. You know, without clinical trials, we would have no treatments. Clinical trials are the only way that we develop new treatments for patients. And I'll give you some examples of that. Without clinical trials, we would have no treatment options for cancer patients, for HIV, for heart failure, for diabetes. Every medicine that's available today, every interventional treatment that's available to patients, those are all a direct result of clinical trials. And without them, we would not make any progress. And oftentimes, clinical trials are compared to standard therapies that are available to patients. And oftentimes for advanced cancers and other diseases, clinical trials might be the very best option for treatment available to patients. I'm going to go over just the types of clinical research that we have here at Eisenhower. And actually, this is broadly, any big centers that are doing research are going to have these type of trials. Just make this little thing. There we go. So treatment research looks at treatments like medications, implants, devices. You know, when your mom or maybe yourself are getting a new knee or a new hip, all of those new devices have gone through a clinical trial. There's also, they do clinical trials with surgery and radiation therapy. There's prevention research. So this is looking at how do we prevent disease in the first place. There's diagnostic research. So this would be things like what imaging modalities are the best to diagnose different conditions and different diseases early. So there's diagnostic research for mammograms. We actually might be participating in a study looking at interventional bronchoscopy here at Eisenhower, which is another diagnostic tool. There's screening research. So what's the best way to detect disease early? Think of, you know, pap smears to detect cervical cancer and anal cancer. There's quality of life research. So looking at how a certain intervention will impact someone's quality of life. And then genetic studies, which actually look at your DNA and your genetics to look at how they may predispose you to a certain disease. And epidemiological studies. And these are very large groups of people that are studied to look at patterns of what they're experiencing from a health perspective to try to develop lifestyle interventions and treatments to keep them healthier. You might have heard about phases of clinical trials, and if you've listened to the news recently as they look at treatments for COVID and vaccines for the coronavirus, those vaccine trials will go through all of these phases, and there are 4 different phases of clinical trials. Those phase 1 trials, this is where they're testing the new drug or treatment in a very small group of people, and they're really looking to evaluate safety, determine what's a safe dose, and look to see if there's any side effects that people are experiencing. What they're not doing, and what they do in phase 2 trials, is they give it to a larger group of people, and then they look at the effectiveness, like how effective is this new treatment that we're offering patients. And then of course, all along every phase of these trials is continuing to evaluate safety. As you include more people, they sometimes identify additional side effects as they get that group of people larger and larger, so they'll continue to track safety. When it comes to clinical trials, the number one most important thing always is patient safety. And you'll hear me say it over and over again. The patient is the center of this. We can't do it without them. And it's our mission to keep them safe while they're participating in a clinical trial. And then in phase 3 trials, those are much larger groups of people, and that's where they're really looking at comparing the new experimental drug or treatment to the standard treatment that's approved, and finding out really, is it more effective than what we currently do? And if it is, that new treatment, that new drug will be the new standard of care. And again, they continue to monitor patients' side effects that they report and gather that information. In phase 4 trials, these are after a treatment or a drug gets approved by the FDA. When you're in a clinical trial, the patient is really monitored very closely. They have a research nurse or a research coordinator and a physician who are in regular contact with them, making sure they're taking their medicines as dictated in the research protocol. And so it's all, very kind of highly structured and regulated. But we all know in real life, when our physicians prescribe us treatments or medicines to take, gosh, we might not be perfect about taking them at exactly the right time, or we might miss a day. Whereas in a clinical trial, your team is going to really make sure the patient's doing it exactly as the trial wants it to. So those phase 4 trials are after the drug gets approved and looking at how people in the real world are taking it and are experiencing, and how they're having side effects or effectiveness of that drug in a real world type setting. Some other types of research that are done, there's not always research that's done specifically to treat a disease. Oftentimes, studies are looking for healthy volunteers to study, and they want healthy volunteers so that they can compare those people to the people with the condition. So I've got some examples here of those studies. They might look at a brain scan of, for example, a normal person that has not had concussions, and comparing those to brain scans of someone like a football player that's had multiple concussions. So the healthy volunteers are an important part of clinical trials as well. Here's some potential risks and benefits of clinical trials to the patient. When you're in a clinical trial, you are being provided healthcare by leading physicians in the field. There's a very selective process that goes on for physicians that do clinical trials, and they're kind of on the cutting edge of new treatments. So you know you have a good physician that's a leader in his field or her field. You potentially have access to new drugs, new devices before they're available to the public at large. You're closely monitored while you're on the clinical trial. As I said, there's the physician and the research nurse and the research coordinator who's really in close touch with you, monitoring your side effects if you have any. And really we engage you when you enroll in a clinical trial. You take a more active role in your health and in your condition. You're going to learn more about it through the informed consent process, and I'll go over a little bit of that later. And if the drug that they're studying or the new treatment that they're studying is found to be more effective, you're going to be one of the first people to benefit. And then for some people, the drug may or may not help them, but they're contributing to science at large. And for some people with advanced cancer who have a terminal illness, they want to participate in clinical trials as a legacy to kind of help the next person that comes along. Of course, there's always risks with something that's experimental. So new drugs, devices, they could have side effects, and they're not always known to physicians, especially if you're in one of those earlier phase, phase trials. At a phase 2 trial, we may not know every single risk that's possible, and we're continuing to get that information from patients who participate. And the drug that they're testing, the device that they're testing, it may turn out to be ineffective or less effective than what it's being compared to. And that's the whole point of doing the clinical trial. We're just not sure if it's better than the current standard, and the only way that scientists are able to do that is comparing those two things head to head. And for some patients, the drug works for others, but for whatever reason, it doesn't work for them. There is a very rigorous government group that's in place to protect patients that participate in clinical trials. The FDA is the overseeing group that makes sure that physicians and health systems that participate in research are following all the rules, and we're monitored very regularly in a very detailed way. And there's also, the federal government has the Office of Human Research Protections. So there are government agencies that provide a lot of monitoring and auditing of systems and health systems that participate in research. And we all have to follow a clinical trial protocol before we start the study, and that's a very detailed document that tells the doctor exactly what needs to be done for a particular trial. The regulations that are in place require all of us to meet with patients, provide them with an informed consent document. The informed consent document, it tells the patient in writing, and actually it's a mandate that it be in very simple, straightforward language, not all the medical jargon. The recommendation is that it's written at a 5th grade level for the informed consent, so just about anybody picking it up could understand it. And that informed consent document tells us why the study is being done, what the risks are, what the benefits are, what's involved, what are the alternative options for patients if they don't want to participate in the clinical trial but want to get treatment for their condition. So it really gives the patient a really good understanding of the condition they're being treated for, the drug or device that's being tested, and alternatives to their treatment, which Oftentimes in kind of a fast-paced healthcare setting, patients don't always have time to spend an hour with a physician to learn all the intricacies of what this new drug they've been prescribed is going to do. But that informed consent document and the research nurse or research coordinator who meets with the patient, spends a healthy amount of time, a good hour going over all this information to make sure the patient really understands what it's about. And I talked about this just a minute ago about the informed consent document, and it talks about the tests, and in addition, the tests the patient may have during the trial. Safety is the #1 priority in any clinical trial. So there's typically laboratory tests, imaging studies that are looking to monitor a patient's kidney function or liver function or their bone marrow while they're on a new treatment. And so the informed consent kind of outlines what the patient's going to expect during their course of treatment on a clinical trial. This is one of the, do participants receive a placebo? And this is one of those myths out there that I want to dispel, that if there is an approved treatment for a patient, it is not ethical to give a placebo. And an institutional review board, which is a group of people that is charged with approving any trials that a doctor wants to do or a hospital wants to do, that institutional review board would never approve a study that involves a placebo when there's an approved treatment. And not to say that there aren't placebos that are used in studies, because there are, but it's when there's not a good alternative treatment for patients. And so the standard of care would not be getting the medication. Trials are often testing drugs which are looking at comparing the new treatment with the standard treatment, and does that new drug work better? Does it work with less side effects? So patients are typically randomly assigned to one of those drugs, the experimental drug or the current standard of care. And as I said, if there's no standard treatment that exists, then there might be a placebo, but otherwise very unusual to have a placebo. So if you decide to participate in a clinical trial, you're going to work closely with a research team, and that includes doctors and nurses and clinical research coordinators. There could be social workers, dietitians, and other healthcare professionals. And their mission in life is to keep you safe and monitor your health while you're participating in that clinical trial. You may have, frequent tests, blood tests while you're in a study, and that's all about safety. The research team will continue to follow you after you finish the treatment in the clinical trial, and this kind of varies. Every clinical trial has a different plan, and I've seen some patients that participate in a clinical trial for as little as 7 weeks. And I have some patients that have participated in clinical trials that I enrolled 16 years ago when they were first diagnosed with cancer. And I'm going to be following them for the rest of their lives. So it just kind of depends on what type of study you're participating in. It could be kind of a short term where it's weeks, or it could be for the rest of your life that the study team follows you. We want to make sure patients are very compliant when they participate in a clinical trial to get good results. We need to make sure that everybody's kind of following the same instructions for taking their medications. And so that's kind of what I call the almost like concierge care when you participate in a clinical trial, because you have a research coordinator, a research nurse that's following you very carefully to make sure you're taking your medicine right and reporting any side effects early so that we can get them taken care of before they turning into something more serious. And every trial has a protocol and a very specific study calendar that tells all of the physicians that are participating what to do when. And what I love about clinical trials, and we have a number of different partnerships with the National Cancer Institute and with UC San Diego Cancer Center, who else? Gosh, and with industry sponsors like Genentech, big names like that. But the same great trial by the national leader in melanoma that's at Harvard, that trial that he wrote the protocol and is offering it to patients all over the country, we get to participate in that, and our patients are getting that same high level of care that people at the biggest and best cancer centers are, because that protocol specifies exactly what we need to do with the patient. And whether you're here or at MD Anderson or Mayo, if we're all using the same protocol, we're doing it the exact same way. When patients are looking at treatments and looking at conditions that they see their doctor for and are considering either getting a surgery or getting an implant or taking a new medicine, those are the times to ask your doctor, hey, are there any opportunities for me to participate in a clinical trial? I actually tell my parents this when they're with their physicians. I'm a believer that you get better care when you are enrolled in a clinical trial, because it's so highly regulated, monitored. If a patient is taking a medicine and doesn't show up for their lab appointment, that patient's going to get a call from the research team saying, oh, hi, Mrs. Smith. I noticed that you didn't go to the lab today. I need you to come on in and get that lab drawn so we can make sure your kidneys are okay. In real life, and I know this from personal experience, if I get a lab requisition or get an order to get a mammogram, if I don't maybe do it exactly when my physician wants me to, or kind of get busy and don't get around to it, no one's really harassing me about, why didn't you go get your mammogram? I wanted to, you're due on June 15th, and why haven't you got it yet? Then maybe the next time I go see my provider, they'll say, oh, wait a minute, you missed your mammogram last year. But when you're in a clinical trial, if it says you need to get a mammogram on June 15th, that research team is going to make sure you get it. And that's one of the benefits of participation. So always ask your doctor when you're talking to him about your conditions, get your specific diagnosis and write it down. I tell my family to always take a pen and paper with you, take some notes while you're there. Better yet, if you can take someone with you to your doctor's appointment, especially if you're being newly diagnosed with a new, condition with diabetes or heart failure, or HIV or cancer. Always take someone with you if you can, and have them act as your scribe and take some notes about what your doctor's saying. It can be overwhelming when you're getting a new diagnosis, and I don't think everything gets into our brains when we're hearing all that new information. But ask your doctor about all the different treatment options that might be available to you and whether there's an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial for the condition in which you're being treated. Some of the questions you can ask your doctor are, what are the goals of the treatment that they have planned for you? Is your condition curable? What are your options? Why are they recommending those options? And then really ask yourself, what are your personal goals for treatment? And that's an important part of decisions on whatever treatment you're receiving, is knowing your goals. And then, do you have enough information to make an informed decision? And you might even ask your doctor for some recommended websites. I think, we're all very familiar with Dr. Google. Anytime we have symptoms or hear something, we Google it, but I recommend that you ask your physician for recommended websites that have good information, so you're able to spend your time on reliable information when it comes to your health. I think for new conditions for which you're being diagnosed and treated, it's always good to ask questions, and you want to make sure that you have a relationship with your physician where you feel comfortable asking questions, and it's okay to get a second opinion. All the physicians that I've worked with, they're fine with patients getting second opinions about treatment recommendations. Because most likely they're going to hear the same thing from the next physician they speak with. And it just kind of validates, what their initial physician had recommended. And like I said before, bring a family member or an advocate to take notes. If you need to seek a second opinion, don't be scared to do that. It's, physicians are okay with you getting a second opinion. So you've heard me talk about standard treatment a couple times, and standard treatment are those surgeries, drugs that experts believe are the best thing to do with patients. They have an FDA approval and are recommended for patients. Standard treatments that are FDA approved, they have side effects just like an experimental medication might have. If you talk to people that are on, chemotherapy or HIV medicines or diabetes medicines, all medicines that we take have side effects. So even if it's the standard of treatment that's the best known medicine for that condition at the moment, they could have side effects. But in some cases, the standard approved treatments are only a little bit effective. And I think a good example of this that I can give you is probably about 10 years ago for melanoma. So for advanced melanoma, a good 10 years ago, the only approved treatment, which was the standard of care and being recommended, was a drug called interferon. And it only worked in about 15% of the advanced melanoma cases. So it wasn't very effective, but it was the only thing available at the time. And boy, have things changed with melanoma. In the last 10 years, I've seen huge changes with melanoma treatments, and actually have had the opportunity to take part in clinical trials for new immunotherapies for both melanoma and lung cancer that are making a world of difference in patients' lives. When you're looking at clinical trials, understand that they are carefully controlled research studies. They're being done by physicians to improve care to patients and improve their quality of life, improve their likelihood of survival, and to treat the condition they have. The whole goal of the clinical trial is to look at that new therapy and see if it's better than the current standard of care, and potentially it has fewer side effects than the current standard of care. So it's looking at effectiveness of that new drug, and also, does it have fewer side effects? So when you're talking about taking a new medicine that might be tested in a clinical trial, ask your physician if it might be right for you. And What I tell my patients is talk to the doctor and say, hey, if this was your mom, would you recommend this clinical trial? And physicians will answer you very honestly. They're not going to participate in clinical trials that they don't think could potentially be of some benefit to a patient. You can ask, not every trial is available in every location. So you can ask your care team about where a clinical trial might be located. There are some great websites that list clinical trials if you're looking for something in particular. There's a website called clinicaltrials.gov, and it's the government's mandated website that any company, the National Cancer Institute, the Division of AIDS, any of the National Institute of Health Studies has to list their clinical trials on that site. And it's a wonderful resource to patients who might be looking for treatment options in a clinical trial for their condition. And you can search by location. And for some patients, especially here in our desert, there are a number of people who are snowbirds or who have family in other places where it's an option for them to go out of the area for treatments. As much as we can, we're doing clinical trials here at Eisenhower so we can keep patients here and in their homes and in their communities and not having to travel hours away for treatments. And then, of course, ask your research team about the side effects of treatment options that are being considered for your condition. So there's going to be side effects, whatever treatment you choose, whether it's a standard of care or whether it's the new experimental treatment, and ask your physicians about that and your care team. Talk to your doctor. Ask as many questions as you have until that answer is clear to you. And I've spent so many hours in clinic exam rooms with patients, and oftentimes as a research nurse, I will be in the exam room with the patient before the physician joins us, and they'll be talking to me and asking me questions and telling me about what they're experiencing and maybe some of the side effects. But when the doctor comes in and asks, how are they doing, or do you have any questions? Oftentimes patients will get real quiet, and I think they feel intimidated sometimes to ask those questions. And that's where, if you have someone with you, if you bring a family member, or like in our case, when you have the research nurse that's with you during that clinic visit, we can advocate for you and say, oh, this is what I would do when I was with patients. I'd say, oh, doctor, we just talked about Mrs. Smith is having some leg cramps due to this new statin that she's trying, and it's keeping her up at night. Do you have some suggestions for that? So talk to your doctor about what you're experiencing and ask questions until you feel comfortable. I also recommend that patients establish a personal medical record. One of the great things about our new electronic age is that we now have electronic medical records. And for Eisenhower patients, we have MyChart. So they can actually, patients can go and look at their lab results and look at their records through MyChart. I also recommend if you're being treated for a serious condition, that you actually get copies of kind of the important reports about your condition, because you might need to have a record of those. These would be things like pathology reports that show your diagnosis if you've had a cancer diagnosis, laboratory reports, imaging studies, so MRIs and CTs. Make a list of the medications you're taking, including supplements, and have that at the ready. So when you're in with your physician and their support team, they can get a full, accurate record of the medications and supplements that you're on. And kind of keep track. There's no one that cares more about your health than you. And so keep track of if you've been treated for things or have diagnoses, and keep a little record and keep a file for yourself in your file drawer that kind of tracks that history. Especially, a lot of us are so mobile and we might go to all different types of doctors, and they might be at different health systems, especially if you're a snowbird. So it's good to kind of have that personal medical record you can take with you if you need to. So each trial has a protocol, and the protocol is what all of us on the scientific end, the physicians, follow when they are participating in a clinical trial. Most studies are done at many different sites or many different locations, and we all use this protocol document to do the study the same way. And before the protocol even gets to the physicians and study team, it's gone through multiple rigorous reviews with the sponsor of the clinical trial that meets FDA guidelines. And so it's going to talk about why the trial is needed, the purpose of it, the drugs that are being tested, or if it's a device, the devices, what kind of treatments are exactly being done, how we're going to monitor safety of the patient through lab tests and imaging and a follow-up schedule. They're going to have safety measures. So if patients start to have side effects, there might be dose reductions that are identified in that protocol. It'll talk exactly about how we're measuring the success of that clinical trial and what outcomes are being looked at. And it gives a very detailed list of eligibility criteria for patients to participate in a clinical trial. They want a very homogeneous population when they're studying a condition. So there's, probably at least 40 different items to ask a patient and determine from their medical history to see if they're even eligible for a clinical trial. And this is to make sure that we're looking at people from similar, have similar conditions, and for safety measures, because we wouldn't want to put someone on a clinical trial if they've got, kidney function that's not adequate, and it wouldn't be safe for them. So that's a safety measure. And then the protocol talks about how the study is being organized, and typically studies are multi-site trials, especially the ones we're doing here at Eisenhower. We're participating in large multi-center trials. And these are just some of the basic steps in drug development. And if you think about the vaccine for COVID that they're trying to develop, initially that vaccine is developed in a lab and studied in the lab, and then the FDA will approve a new application for that vaccine. And then the vaccine can be studied in people, which are very carefully controlled clinical trials. And I'm sure there will be, additional phases for vaccine trials that are done before those get to us out in the population at large. So for the phase 1 study, those are looking at safety and side effects, looking at dosages, and the best way to give the treatment to someone. Is it best in a pill form, in an injection, or an infusion? So that's what phase 1 trials are doing. Typically include a small number of people, 20, less than 100 typically. Phase 2 trial starts to look at effectiveness and safety, and It typically has less than 100 people. Sometimes they can go up to 300 people. And then phase 3 trials are looking not only at effectiveness and side effects and safety, but comparing it to the current standard of care. And those trials include, can include thousands of people. And then the phase 4 gathers even more information after that, drug or treatment is out and being widely used by patients, just to make sure it's still safe and effective in the way people are taking it in everyday life. There's something called randomization in clinical trials, and it is possible that you could get randomized to the current standard of care or to the experimental drug that's being tested. Some trials are double-blind and randomized, which means that the physician doesn't know which drug you're getting. You don't know which drug you're getting. It could be the current standard of care, or it could be the study drug, and neither one of you will know. The physician won't know, the study team won't know, and the patient won't know. So there's always a potential that you could get randomized to the standard of care in a clinical trial. Placebos, again, rarely used in clinical trial. They're used when there's no current standard of care, and then it is ethical. Here's just a timeline for drug approval, just so you can get a general idea on how long it can take to develop treatments. But here's a drug called rituximab that's used in CLL, and it can take a good 5 years from when the antibodies are developed in the lab to when that phase 3 clinical trial is done. And then you see even longer to a point where we have nearing 1 million survivors for CLL today. So it can be a long process. I think that, when it comes to COVID and vaccines, there's going to be so much time, energy, and resources poured into this. We're going to see that whole drug development cycle or vaccine development cycle get faster. But remember, all of those checks and balances are in place for patient safety, and we don't want to rush things out and either not have them work, or even worse, cause harm to people. So it's important that we let the FDA kind of guide that. It's for patient safety that those things are in place. So clinical trials can be an important option for treatment of disease. Gosh, we don't have, in the trials that I've been working with, we have not had an upper cutoff range. I have cared for people in clinical trials that have been well into their 90s and getting treatments in clinical trials. And oftentimes it's more about their performance status or their functional status. How is this 90-year-old doing? Honestly, some of these people, I feel like they're in better shape than I am. They're still active and, playing tennis or golfing or swimming every day. So trials are open to older people. We encourage all different races to participate. You gotta get all that information in, because a drug might work differently in one population than another. And what else do I want to tell you about this? Participating in a clinical trial, considering an experimental treatment or medication can be a reasonable treatment for your condition. And that's a discussion that you need to have with your physician after careful consideration and gathering the information you need to make that decision. Patients are very closely monitored when they're put on clinical trials. I call it concierge care. They get a lot of attention and support from the research team and the physicians, and are watched very closely for safety. For safety in clinical trials, the sponsor of the trial actually has outside experts that review the merit of the study. And so there's lots of eyes on that before it gets to patients. The institutional review board is that committee of experts. And before we open a clinical trial, or actually this is any medical center, any physician, anybody that does clinical trials, before they're allowed to open that clinical trial and enroll patients, they have to get approval from an institutional review board, and they look at the scientific merit of the study. They look to see if it's ethical. They want to make sure that we're minimizing risks and how we're looking to treat side effects. Their goal is to protect patients who participate in clinical trials. They want to make sure that there's an informed consent in place and that no patients are being coerced or unduly influenced by their physician to participate. Patients should never feel pressured by anyone to participate in a clinical trial. It's totally optional and up to the patient whether they want to participate or not. So if you're ever feeling pressured by anyone to participate in a clinical trial, you should probably put on the brakes and consider something else. You should never feel pressured. Should you have questions? Yes. And that's what the doctor and the research team is there to do, to make sure you have your questions answered, but you should never feel pressured to participate. And the IRB also wants to look at all of the safety data. So they're going to be monitoring all the side effects that patients have and making sure you're protecting the patient and treating their side effects early, and also, of course, protecting the privacy of patients through HIPAA. Your doctor and your study team are going to talk to you about the goals of the study, the benefits and risks, what is expected of you. There is a commitment when you participate in a clinical trial. We need you to come in and come in for your follow-up visits and get your lab tests when you need. So it is a bit of a commitment on the patient's end. Sometimes there's diaries to fill out. So it is a commitment when a patient decides to participate. And it's not for everybody, but we always want to make sure patients know what they're getting into before they commit to participating in a clinical trial. And then additionally, you know, if someone decides after they've started on a clinical trial and maybe you're a few months into it that they don't like the way the medication's making them feel, or they just are not up for all the additional safety monitoring that's in place. A patient always has the right to withdraw from a clinical trial, and that's a patient's right. They can withdraw at any time for any reason without any repercussions from anyone, and it's perfectly okay. But that's a discussion you have with your physician and study team. You know, depending on the medication, there might be some tapering that's necessary, but know that when you're participating in a clinical trial as a patient, you're in the driver's seat, you're in control, and you have the autonomy to make decisions. And you just need to let your physician know how you're feeling and know what you want to do, but we're going to respect that. Informed consent. This is one of the kind of touchstones of participating in clinical trials where we really want patients to understand what's involved with the study and their role and the purpose. We provide consents in different languages, and we want it to be in a language that people understand. As I said, it's written in a fifth grade, at a fifth grade level. And if someone needs an interpreter, we have those available for patients. We just tell patients to take time, you know, when you get that informed consent document for a clinical trial, take it home, take some time, read through it, You know, write down your notes as you're reviewing that information, and you know, talk to your friends and family about it. Maybe do a little Googling and see what you find out, and then come back, meet with the physician, meet with the research nurse or the research coordinator, and make sure you have all your questions answered before you consent to participate. And again, patients can withdraw their consent to participate at any time. So there are things you should be aware of when it comes to healthcare coverage in clinical trials. For big trials that are funded by the National Institute of Health and its different divisions, like the National Cancer Institute and the Division of AIDS, they've done a beautiful thing where there's a Medicare coverage determination that if that's a big clinical trial funded by one of our government research institutes, Medicare covers participation in a clinical trial just like they would cover your routine care. So they're going to cover the imaging. If you're, you know, let's just take a cancer trial with the National Cancer Institute. If you're participating on that in a Medicare patient, you're going to have all your normal copays that you would normally have, but all of the treatment within that clinical trial is going to be covered just like you were getting an FDA-approved treatment. And then for those studies that are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, they will typically pay so that patients aren't incurring unnecessary costs to participate. This is always something to look into before you enroll in the clinical trial. Kind of have a, you know, get a good understanding of what costs might be covered by your insurance or what might not be covered by your insurance, because every insurance company is a little bit different. Medicare, Medi-Cal, you know, they do cover clinical trials that are, at least for cancer clinical trials, that are funded by the National Cancer Institute. So before you make any treatment decisions about your condition, you know, ask questions. Make sure you understand your diagnosis. Make sure you understand what the different treatment options are. Ask your doctor, are there options that are within clinical trials? And at least hear your physician out about those and consider them. If you do participate in a clinical trial, at the minimum, you're going to get the currently approved best standard of care treatment that's available. And, you know, based on that randomization, you're either getting the current standard of care that's the best treatment available today, or you're getting this experimental treatment that might be better than the current standard of care. And you could be among the first to get that new drug and benefit from it. You're going to get lots of oversight from your research team, and that's all about patient safety and making sure that you're protected. And you're going to have access to doctors who have lots of experience with the condition you're being treated for. So if you are considering treatment in a clinical trial, I have this lovely list of questions, and I might have to, if any of the participants want.
We actually have a couple as well.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we were kind of holding, so we'll take a break for 1 sec here. So the first question comes from Donald, and it says, are there clinical trials during the COVID-19? And are you able to get an appointment with a doctor in person? If you're able to get a doctor in person, you can't have anyone in the room with you currently. So how does that work with clinical trials?
Well, I have parents who don't live here in the desert, and so I like to be engaged in their healthcare. And most smartphones these days have capabilities where you can participate in, like I participate in my parents' visits with them virtually and have them either do FaceTime so I can see what's going on, or I'm on the speakerphone so I can do it that way. So if you physically can't be present with your loved one when they're there, that's an option. I know it's not ideal, but it is an option. Do we have clinical trials right now with COVID? Yes. We do. We are still enrolling people to clinical trials. You know, some of the trials have been put on hold. For example, for elective surgeries, the elective surgeries were put on hold for a period of time. And so some of the studies that were looking at devices for elective surgeries were put on hold for a time period. We are still seeing patients in our cancer center, and those visits are being done in person, and we're still enrolling people to cancer treatment trials. So yeah, I mean, I know it's a little bit more challenging right now to do it, but patients, when absolutely necessary, are being seen in the clinics by physicians. I think whenever possible, if you can, you know, if your physician is offering virtual visits and you can do that, you know, you might consider that for the time being. But no, the clinical trials program is still open, and patients are still enrolling.
Great, thank you. Another question.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that comes from Jeff. It says, are informed consents really written at the 5th grade level? Question mark. I don't think I've ever seen one at that level, unfortunately.
Yeah, you know, it's because they're long, and you know, most of my experience is in oncology and cancer trials, and so some of those informed consent documents can be 50 pages long, and I think, you know, is this reasonable for a 5th grader to read? And you know, I have had my 5th grader read some things, and she does understand it, but I totally understand where you're coming from. That, you know, that's the rule. They're supposed to be writing them at a 5th grade level. I think can be challenging to do that. I think the sponsors of clinical trials do their very best to try to simplify things. And there's this very fine balance between giving a patient all the information they need in a written form to make a good decision and to have all the information available, and you know, the document being overwhelming, where the patient is just overwhelmed by the volume of information. And the informed consent process, it's a process. It's not a document. The document is just one piece of it. And like I said, I think I said before, you know, we typically spend about an hour with a patient. The normal process is when a patient's being seen by a physician and talking about treatment options for their condition, the doctor might mention the clinical trial as well as other treatments, and give a little bit of information about the clinical trial, give an overview of it and why they think it's a reasonable option for the patient. And then typically the physician will call in the research nurse or the research coordinator to come talk to the patient and provide that informed consent document. And typically we like patients to go home, you know, think about that, read through it, write down their questions, and then I typically will schedule a follow-up appointment with the patient where I meet with them for, typically it's an hour to go through things. And, you know, my goal is to make sure that they first understand their diagnosis, because many times people don't even have a good understanding of their diagnosis just because they're getting so much information in the beginning, and they're speaking to physicians who use physician language a lot of times. And so I make sure people really understand their diagnosis, and if they don't understand something that the physician said, to help them better understand that and make sure that they know what their treatment options are, including treatment in the clinical trial, and getting them to a point where they can make a good decision about the participation. But point well taken. They're supposed to be written at a 5th grade level, but I don't know, I think we have some pretty smart 5th graders out there.
Maybe so. Let's open it up for questions, and you can unmute yourself if you would like, or raise your hand and we can call on you if you have additional questions.
Stephanie, could I ask you about second opinions?
Sure.
Is it fair to ask your doctor to give you a second, like refer you to someone for a second opinion? Or are you on your own to go find a second opinion? I always feel like if I ask and they put me with someone else in their own practice, of course they're going to give me the same opinion. And if I look for somebody, like for example, outside of Eisenhower, now it might be out of my insurance network. And so then I'm sometimes struggling with, how do I find that second opinion?
Yeah, so I think, you know, a lot of patients will, they want to get second opinions at large tertiary centers, so big academic centers, or especially people who, you know, have that dual residency and might be coming from back east or from Seattle or, you know, different places. They oftentimes will want to get a second opinion in their home base.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's reasonable. I think it's reasonable, especially with, I mean, do I think you need a second opinion for every little thing?
Right.
No.
Right.
But, you know, if you've got a very, a serious condition that, you know, really warrants a second opinion, I think it's fair to say, you know, doctor, if you, if your mom, if your wife was diagnosed with this and you were recommending where to get a second opinion outside of the desert, where would you do that?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how the question can be posed. You know, I think if you're comfortable with your physician and trust them and have a great relationship, do you need a second opinion? No, not necessarily. But there are some patients that I've seen be very kind of ambivalent about the treatment options that their physician is giving them. And, you know, I get it. They're scared. They've got a very serious diagnosis. And so in those cases, for sure, it's reasonable to get a second opinion because what I've seen, and remember, I have a narrower view because I'm working with patients who are being considered for clinical trials. When my physicians are recommending treatment within a clinical trial, it's typically because it's the best treatment option available. And there's not other good standards of care for them. And so what that patient's going to hear when they go to a, you know, bigger center is they're going to get validated that what their Eisenhower physician recommended was the right approach. And it's going to make them feel comfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So getting that second opinion doesn't mean you're going to go elsewhere for treatment. It might just be that validation you're looking for to know that you can get your treatment locally.
Well, exactly.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I see most often, that for those patients that are questioning, you know, is this the right thing for me? I'm just not sure. And they're very, you know, they're just ambivalent about it. When they get that second opinion from the outside place that's in the bigger city, what they're told is your Eisenhower physician has given you the best recommendation for your treatment, and I recommend that you get it. And and then they don't have to travel out of town. They can get treatment right here near home.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great question. Anyone else? Another question from someone? No.
It doesn't sound like it. So I just want to thank Stephanie. It was very informative, and I certainly learned a lot tonight. So thank you for sharing all that wonderful knowledge that you have about clinical trials with us tonight. Our next Eisenhower Center presentation will be on August 12th, correct? Brett?
Yes, that is.
And it's communication challenges when wearing face masks. So I'm guessing that's going to be a real popular one, if I'm not mistaken, because I know I wind up repeating myself several times, and especially when you're talking over a distance or in a store where it's loud and you're trying to get your information across or your question, or so that there has been a lot of repeating going on. So that'll be an interesting one for sure. So thank you all very much for participating in this tonight. And we look forward to seeing you all on August 12th.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.